When most people hear the word Viking, they think of fearless warriors, seafaring explorers, and rugged adventurers. But beneath the surface of Norse glory lies a darker, more brutal reality. Central to Viking society wasn't just honor, bravery, or conquest, it was slavery. Known as thralls, slaves were a fundamental part of everyday life in the Viking world, and their stories reveal a disturbing underbelly to the mythic tales of old. Slavery, among the Norse, was not just a byproduct of war, it was a system. The Vikings didn't merely capture people for revenge or punishment, they hunted them. Raids across the British Isles, Ireland, and the Slavic regions weren't random outbursts of violence. They were calculated expeditions for profit. Villages and monasteries were targeted not just for their wealth, but for their human cargo. Monks, farmers, women, and children, anyone unlucky enough to be in the wrong place, were seized, bound, and taken to Viking markets. One of the biggest centers of this human trade was Hedeby, a major trading town in what is now Germany. Here, captured people were bought, sold, and shipped across the Norse world. From Iceland to Constantinople, the reach of Viking slavery stretched wide. Arab chroniclers like Ibn Fadlan and others documented Viking traders along the Volga River who sold slaves to the Muslim world, often describing them as cold, cruel, and completely indifferent to the suffering of the people they bartered. The life of a thrall was harsh and unforgiving. They could be forced to farm, build, or serve in households, but their roles extended beyond labor. Women were especially vulnerable. Many were taken as concubines or forcibly married to their captors, their identities erased, and their fates sealed. Children born of slaves were often slaves themselves, though manumission freedom granted by a master was possible in some cases. Still, their status remained permanently marked, and even freed thralls were often second-class citizens. The Norse sagas, while often romanticized, don't shy away from mentioning slavery. In fact, they talk about thralls almost casually as an everyday fact of life. The heroic tales of Viking warriors are filled with moments where slaves are gifted, killed, or used as pawns in power games. A chieftain's wealth was often measured not only in silver or land, but in the number of people he owned. This wasn't seen as shameful. It was a symbol of status and dominance. Religious conversion in Scandinavia didn't immediately change this. Even as Christianity spread, slavery persisted. Some Christian rulers in Scandinavia even used the church's teachings to justify enslaving pagans. It wasn't until the late medieval period that slavery began to fade in the north, pushed out by both economic changes and evolving moral frameworks. But for centuries, it was not just tolerated, it was foundational. This hidden history challenges the image of the Viking as a noble barbarian. It shows us a society deeply reliant on human suffering. The Norse were master traders, expert sailors, and legendary warriors, but they were also slave raiders, human traffickers, and ruthless profiteers. This reality doesn't erase their achievements, but it paints them in a fuller, harsher light. The Viking Age wasn't just about exploration, it was about exploitation. And for the thousands of thralls whose names were never recorded, whose voices were never heard, the Viking world was a prison from which there was little escape. The Viking Age was forged in fire, the fire of burning villages, monasteries, and towns. The Norse raids that terrorized Europe from the late 8th to the 11th centuries were not isolated or spontaneous. They were often methodical, seasonal, and strategically planned campaigns of violence designed to plunder wealth and instill fear. The first widely recognized Viking raid took place in 793 CE, when Norsemen attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, an island off the northeast coast of England. To the Christian world, it was a horrifying desecration, a sacred place defiled by blood and steel. But to the Vikings, it was a target rich in treasure and unarmed people. The choice was not random. Monasteries were filled with gold, relics, and supplies, and they were often poorly defended. This pattern of choosing soft targets would become a hallmark of Viking raids. These attacks soon expanded. Ireland, Scotland, and northern France bore the brunt of early Viking brutality. River systems became highways of invasion. Norse ships, with their shallow drafts and extraordinary speed, could move far inland with little warning. Towns like Rouen, Hamburg, and Paris were raided multiple times. In 845, a Viking fleet under the legendary chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok, or someone later mythologized as him, sailed up the Seine and sacked Paris, demanding a ransom to leave. What terrified the locals most wasn't just the violence, it was the unpredictability. The Vikings struck in the dead of night or in broad daylight. They appeared where no army could be mustered in time. Survivors described them as demons, ghosts, or divine punishment, because their savagery was unlike anything Europe had seen for centuries. But contrary to the myth of mindless barbarism, these raids often had a clear economic and political logic. The Norse targeted regions during times of internal instability or leadership transitions. They learned local customs, geography, and vulnerabilities. Sometimes they even returned to the same village year after year, like seasonal harvesters, only the crop was silver, slaves, and blood. Some Vikings turned their raids into longer occupations. Coastal settlements in Ireland and northern England became Viking strongholds. Cities like Dublin started as Norse encampments. Over time, these bases grew into permanent trading hubs, but they were born from violence. The tactics used during these raids were brutal. Massacres of civilians were common, not just for loot but as psychological warfare. Buildings were burned, leaders were executed or humiliated, and captives were chained together and marched back to ships. Resistance was often met with disproportionate cruelty, whole villages wiped out as a warning to others. Vikings also took part in ritual killings, including what some sources call the blood eagle, a gruesome execution method that may or may not be myth. While historians debate its authenticity, the fear it generated was very real. Norse raiders crafted their image as monsters to spread panic before they ever arrived. The reputation was a weapon, and it worked. Yet even within Norse society, there were disagreements about this way of life. Some sagas depict raiders as outlaws or morally suspect figures. As Viking societies became more settled and Christianized, internal tensions grew between those who sought stability and those who preferred chaos and plunder. But during the height of the Viking Age, raids were a key part of Norse identity. Young men earned glory and wealth by spilling blood. Kings and jarls measured their power by how many ships they could launch in spring. And for the people of medieval Europe, the sight of dragon-prowed ships on the horizon was a sign to flee, to pray, or to prepare to die. The image of the Viking as a heroic explorer overlooks this era of terror. For generations, coastal communities lived under constant threat not because they were at war, but because they were near the sea. And the sea, in those centuries, belonged to the Northmen. Viking warfare was not just about strength and courage, it was about efficiency, fear, and domination. The Norse were not bound by the chivalric ideals that would later define European knights. Their tactics were shaped by pragmatism and brutality, designed to break enemies quickly and utterly, to instill terror before a battle even began. Viking armies didn't march in rigid formation. They fought in fluid warbands, often led by powerful chieftains or kings. Each warrior brought his own weapons, typically an axe, spear, or sword, and his own armor, if he could afford it. Shields were central to their strategy. Formations like the shield wall, a dense line of interlocked shields, allowed Vikings to both defend and strike with lethal coordination. But battlefield skill was only part of the equation. The Vikings excelled in psychological warfare. Their reputation preceded them. Tales of their raids spread like wildfire, burned churches, massacred towns, enslaved women. These stories weren't always exaggerated. The Vikings wanted to be feared. In many cases, towns would surrender without a fight, offering gold or supplies simply to avoid destruction. This kind of intimidation was often more effective than the sword. When they faced resistance, the Vikings responded with overwhelming cruelty. They killed prisoners of war without hesitation. They burned villages to the ground. They targeted not only soldiers but civilians, understanding that to break a people, you must break their spirit. The idea of total war was not a modern invention. It was practiced by the Norse in the most literal sense. Even their naval tactics were brutal and efficient. Viking longships weren't just transportation, they were war machines. Fast, maneuverable, and capable of landing almost anywhere, these ships gave Viking forces the ability to strike where no one expected them, then vanish just as quickly. Their control of rivers and coastlines allowed them to isolate cities, disrupt trade, and cripple local economies. In battle, Vikings used hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and night attacks. They didn't follow rules of engagement or declare war with ceremony. To them, war was about gain and glory, not honor. They would attack during religious holidays, when defenses were down, or during harvest, when men were in the fields. Nothing was sacred. Everything was an opportunity. Some warriors went even further. The berserkers, ferocious fighters, said to enter a trance-like fury, became legendary for their inhuman rage and fearlessness. Clad in animal pelts, often howling like beasts, they would charge into enemy lines with no regard for wounds or death. Whether fueled by ritual, substances, or sheer psychological conditioning, they represented the most terrifying face of Viking violence. But ruthlessness wasn't confined to the battlefield. Political maneuvering among Viking leaders could be just as savage. Betrayal, assassination, and forced oaths were common tools of statecraft. A jarl might eliminate a rival not through negotiation, but by burning his hall while he slept, or poisoning him at a feast. Alliances were fragile, often sealed with blood and broken with fire. Conquest brought no peace. In places like England and Ireland, Norse settlers continued to wage war long after establishing control. They demanded tribute, so-called Danegeld, from local rulers, promising not to attack in exchange for silver. This protection money became a cycle of extortion, pay or perish. Even within their own communities, Vikings enforced law with violence. Execution, mutilation, and outlawry were common punishments. A man declared outlaw was denied all legal protection. He could be killed on sight. Justice was swift, brutal, and often public, serving as both punishment and deterrent. The Viking way of war was not just a matter of conquest. It was a way to assert dominance, crush resistance, and reshape entire societies. Through terror, speed, and unrelenting violence, the Norse carved their legacy into the bones of Europe. And while their sagas may celebrate the heroism of great warriors, they also reflect a culture where mercy was rare and survival came at a cost. Today, the Vikings are often remembered for their ships, their exploration, and their myths. But behind the romance lies a legacy of brutality. Their tactics were not just effective, they were remorseless. And for those who faced them on the battlefield, in their villages, or in their homes, the coming of the Northmen meant one thing: no mercy. When we think of Vikings, the first image that comes to mind is often that of bearded warriors in horned helmets, an image both inaccurate and deeply masculine. But there's another side to the Norse world, one just as compelling and often overlooked: the women. Viking women played crucial roles in shaping the Norse world, both at home and beyond. Far from passive figures, they were active participants in trade, politics, exploration, religion, and even warfare. Their lives were complex, multifaceted, and deserved to be examined with the same depth as their male counterparts. In the Viking Age, society was structured around family and kinship. The household, or heimili, was the center of life, and women often ran it. When the men went off to sea for raiding or trading missions that could last months, women stayed behind not just as caretakers but as managers of farms, estates, and sometimes entire villages. The Norse legal system even supported this autonomy. Women could inherit land, file for divorce, and reclaim dowries. Documents like the Gragas laws from medieval Iceland reveal that Norse women had legal standings that, in many cases, surpassed those of their contemporaries in Christian Europe. The key role of a woman in the Viking household was that of the husfreyja, the lady of the house. This was not a decorative title. The husfreyja had control over domestic resources and wielded the household keys, a symbol of authority. Archaeological finds have frequently uncovered keys in women's graves, highlighting their status and control over property and goods. These weren't just tools, they were symbols of power. But Viking women were not confined to their homes. Some joined trading expeditions, traveled across Europe, and even reached the Middle East. Norse sagas tell us of women who owned ships, ran businesses, and settled new lands. The Icelandic sagas are particularly rich in stories of strong, assertive women, like Aud the Deep-Minded, a widow who led her clan to settle in Iceland and claimed land in her own name. Such stories weren't seen as extraordinary in the Norse world. They were part of the social fabric. Marriage, too, was an area where Viking women had surprising rights. While arranged marriages were common, a woman could reject a suitor and could initiate divorce if she felt mistreated or if her husband had abandoned her. The dowry system worked both ways. Families provided women with goods, land, or livestock that remained her personal property even after marriage. In a divorce, she could take it all back, sometimes along with compensation if the separation was her husband's fault. Children were also central to Viking women's lives, though child-rearing was a shared responsibility within the household and extended family. Both boys and girls were valued, although sons were expected to carry the family name forward. However, girls were often named after strong maternal ancestors, suggesting a deep respect for matrilineal heritage. Religiously, women were guardians of rituals and traditions. They maintained family shrines and honored the gods with offerings. Some became priestesses or gidjas, women dedicated to the service of specific gods, often Freya or Frigg. These roles placed them in charge of seasonal festivals, sacrifices, and the maintenance of sacred spaces. Religious authority, like domestic authority, was a form of real power. We also have evidence that women held social influence beyond their families. Widows, especially, could become powerful figures. With their husbands dead and children grown, they controlled estates and wealth without male oversight. Some became benefactors, storytellers, even lawmakers in their local communities. In places like Iceland and the Danelaw regions of England, such women were documented witnesses in legal disputes and property transactions. One reason Viking women have often been marginalized in historical narratives is the lack of direct written records from the Norse themselves. Much of what we know comes from archaeology, foreign chronicles, and the sagas, which were written down a couple of centuries after the Viking Age. But modern scholarship has started to peel back these layers and reveal the complex, varied lives Viking women led. Whether managing the farm, negotiating a trade deal, performing a sacred rite, or setting sail to unknown shores, Viking women were essential players in the Norse world. They were not silent bystanders in a male-dominated saga. They wrote their own stories in deeds, in family lines, in the way they shaped the Viking world from within. Their impact is not only worthy of acknowledgement, it demands a rethinking of what we mean when we say Viking. The image of Viking life is often dominated by warriors raiding distant shores, but much of Norse society was driven not by plunder but by trade. Viking ships didn't only carry axes and shields, they carried furs, amber, textiles, and silver. In this vast interconnected network of commerce, Viking women played a vital and often underestimated role. Far from being limited to domestic duties, many Norse women were deeply involved in trade and the economic lifeblood of their communities. Archaeological evidence and historical records point to their active participation in both local and long-distance markets. Their status and wealth weren't just inherited or acquired through marriage. Many women were self-sufficient economic agents who owned property, ran businesses, and made deals in their own names. At the heart of this activity was the home, which functioned as both a domestic space and an economic center. Women oversaw the production of wool, linen, and garments, all valuable commodities in both Scandinavian and foreign markets. High-quality Viking textiles were prized across Europe and the Middle East. The production process, from spinning to weaving to dyeing, was complex and labor-intensive, and Norse women mastered it. The knowledge of materials, colors, and trade value made them experts in their own right. But some women didn't stop at production. They became merchants, traveling along rivers and coastal routes to sell their goods. Excavations at trading hubs like Hedeby, Ribe, Berka, and Kaupang have revealed artifacts associated with female traders, including weights, scales, and key symbols of economic control. In Burqa, women's graves have been found with imported jewelry and foreign coins, suggesting that they not only handled wealth, but also understood its broader exchange value. One of the most compelling aspects of Viking trade was its scale. Norse merchants sailed from the North Atlantic to the Caspian Sea. Viking artifacts have been found as far as Baghdad, Constantinople, and the Silk Road. Slavic and Arab sources mention encounters with Norse traders, many of whom included women. The travel wasn't just the domain of men. Some women crossed seas and rivers, founded settlements, and acted as cultural mediators between Norse and foreign communities. One of the clearest examples of this is in the colonization of new lands. When Norse explorers settled Iceland, Greenland, and parts of the British Isles, women were among the first to arrive. They weren't passive passengers, they were pioneers. According to the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, which details the colonization of Iceland, women like Aud the Deep-Minded led entire expeditions. After the death of her husband, Aud commissioned a ship, gathered followers, and sailed to Iceland, where she claimed land for her kin. She established a farm, distributed land to her followers, and lived out her days as a respected matriarch. Her story is not portrayed as exceptional, but as part of the expected resilience and agency of a Norse woman. In Greenland, women participated in farming, managing livestock, preserving food, and building homes. They played key roles in adapting Norse practices to new and harsh environments. Far from civilization, their survival depended not on obedience, but initiative. They bred animals, processed dairy, and organized winter storesall while raising children and keeping households functioning. Their work laid the foundations for generations of settlers in some of the most inhospitable places known to the Norse. Some even crossed into realms usually considered off-limits for women. In Rus's and the Islamic world, women may have served as trade liaisons, translators, or even couriers. Scandinavian travelers were often multilingual, and women who married into foreign communities likely acted as cultural bridges sharing Norse traditions while adopting local customs. In this way, they became transmitters of language, fashion, and belief systems. Their reach wasn't limited to goods. Viking women carried stories, symbols, and faith. Many wore amulets, including Thor's hammers and solar discs, suggesting a spiritual identity that traveled with them. They also carried traditions of song, food preparation, and domestic designalements that transformed foreign settlements into recognizably Norse homes. Economic power translated into social power. Wealthy women, especially widows, or those whose husbands were away for long periods, exercised significant autonomy. They managed land leases, oversaw labor, and controlled surplus production. In legal documents from Norse settlements in Britain and Ireland, women appear as landowners, witnesses, and litigants. Their names are on contracts, their property disputes recorded. These were not ornamental figures. They were fully involved in the commercial life of the Viking world. This blend of mobility, knowledge, and pragmatism made Viking women more than just helpers. They were decision-makers, risk-takers, and builders of communities. Their presence in trade routes and colonial settlements was essential not only for their skills in labor, but for the stability and continuity of Norse culture abroad. The Viking Age was as much about creation as it was about conquest. While men may have claimed glory in battle, it was often women who ensured that what they built would endure. Through trade, settlement, and leadership, they expanded the Norse world not just geographically, but socially and economically. In the Viking world, magic was not a relic of superstition. It was a living force, woven into daily life, deeply respected and feared. And at the heart of this mystical tradition stood women. Priestesses, seeresses, and witches occupied a sacred, liminal space in Norse society, both revered and avoided. Their roles connected them to the gods, the dead, and the unknown. These were the women who shaped fate, who read the omens, who chanted in tongues while holding staffs and wearing cloaks laced with ritual significance. These were the Valyur. The Volva, plural, Voljur, was a seeress, a woman of deep spiritual power. Her primary role was to practice Seether, a complex form of magic that involved prophecy, communication with spirits, and influence over fate. Seether was associated with the Norse goddess Freya, and to a lesser extent with Odin, though Odin's use of it was often viewed as subversive, even dangerous, because Seether was considered inherently feminine. Practicing it meant stepping outside rigid social norms, and for men, it came with accusations of ergi, or unmanliness. But for women, it was a recognized and sometimes celebrated role. The vulva was not a common figure. She lived on the edge of society, often literally on the outskirts of towns or in isolated farms. Yet when she arrived, she was welcomed with ceremony. The most famous account of such a visit comes from the saga of Eric the Red. In it, a vulva named Thorbjorg is invited to a Greenlandic settlement during a time of famine and despair. She is dressed in rich, ritualistic clothing, blue cloak, glass beads, catskin gloves, and a staff with a carved knob. She performs a ceremony involving songs and trance, offering visions of the future and advice to the settlers. The account is detailed and respectful, showing the vulva as a figure of authority and mystery. The attire of these women was never accidental. Archaeological finds of female graves containing staffs, elaborate cloaks, and amulets suggest that Valar were not just fictional creations. The Oseberg burial in Norway, often believed to be that of a high-status woman or priestess, included a richly decorated wagon, tapestries, and a staff that some interpret as magical in nature. The grave's contents, along with its ceremonial layout, suggest deep ritual significance. Beyond Seether, women also engaged in other forms of spiritual and magical practice. They prepared protective charms, interpreted dreams, and performed healing rituals. Some were midwives who acted as spiritual guardians during childbirth, believed to ease the soul's transition into the world. Others specialized in rune magic or incantations designed to protect ships, animals, or children. But there was a darker side to this mystical power. While some magic users were respected, others were feared. Accusations of witchcraft could lead to exile or execution, especially as Christianity began to spread through the Norse world. Pagan rituals were demonized, and the old gods were replaced by saints and clerics. Women who once held positions of spiritual leadership were now cast as heretics, sorceresses, or devil worshippers. Despite this, the traditions didn't vanish overnight. Elements of Norse magic survived in folk practices passed down through generations. Women continued to whisper charms against illness, to wear amulets of Thor or Freya, to mark doors with runes. The Christianization of Scandinavia was gradual, and the spiritual resilience of Norse women helped preserve fragments of the old ways even as the official religion shifted. The importance of female magic users in the Viking world also had mythological roots. Norse cosmology is full of powerful women who control fate and reality. The Norns, three mysterious figures who dwell at the roots of Yggdrasil, weave the destinies of gods and mortals alike. Even Odin, chief of the gods, must bow to the fate they decree. Then there's Freyja herself, goddess of love, war, and magic, who taught Seether to the Aesir. Her dual nature, both nurturing and ferocious, mirrored the spiritual power of Norse women. In daily life, this meant that a woman's connection to the divine was more than symbolic. It gave her agency, authority, and a voice in matters both personal and communal. In a society built around family and kinship, the ability to influence fate wasn't just mystical, it was political. Interestingly, there were male practitioners of Seether too, such as Odin, but their roles were far more fraught. For men, engaging in feminine-coded magic risked social ridicule or worse. This reinforces the idea that Seether was a distinctly female domain that gave women power where other societal avenues might have been closed. And it wasn't always about fear and prophecy. Women also officiated life events, births, marriages, funerals. Their chants, blessings, and rituals bound communities together and kept tradition alive. They marked the seasons, gave thanks to the land, and ask the gods for fertility and protection. These roles didn't make headlines or get carved into runestones, but they were the glue of Viking spiritual life. Ultimately, Viking women of magic held a paradoxical position. They were outsiders and insiders, respected and feared, sacred and dangerous. They lived in the spaces between the living and the dead, the natural and supernatural, the male and female. And in doing so, they carved out a unique kind of power, one that could not be taken by sword or law. In Norse society, to know the future was to hold the strings of the present, and the ones who held those strings were often women. Among the most enduring and controversial figures in Norse history is the Shield Maiden, a woman who fought alongside men in battle. Were they myth, metaphor, or historical reality? The truth, as with much in the Viking world, lies somewhere in between legend and evidence. Old Norse sagas and poetry are rich with tales of women who wielded swords, led armies, and embraced death with the same ferocity as their male counterparts. Lagertha, the legendary wife of Ragnar Lothbrok, is said to have fought fiercely in battle, dressed in male armor. The Hervarar saga tells of Hervor, who trained in warfare, dressed as a man, and reclaimed her father's cursed sword from beyond the grave. And then there's Brynhild, the Valkyrie turned mortal, who fought with supernatural skill before being bound by fate and prophecy. But do these tales reflect historical fact or romantic invention? For centuries, historians leaned toward the idea that shield maidens were mostly myth. The prevailing belief was that Viking warfare was the realm of men, and the sagas merely used female warriors as narrative tools. However, archaeological evidence has begun to challenge that assumption. In 2017, researchers revisited a high-status warrior grave in Birka, Sweden, originally excavated in the late 1800s and long believed to belong to a male chieftain. The grave contained a full set of weapons, including a sword, axe, spear, arrows, and a game board used for military strategy. It was assumed for over a century that such a burial must belong to a man. But modern DNA testing revealed something extraordinary. The skeleton was female. This wasn't just a woman buried with weapons. It was a woman buried as a warrior, honored with all the symbols of tactical command. Her bones showed no signs of domestic labor or maternal stress, but rather a life consistent with physical training and possible battle injury. This find doesn't prove that all Viking women fought, but it proves that at least some did, and were honored for it. Moreover, other graves have yielded female remains buried with weapons, though their interpretation remains debated. Were these ceremonial? Were they symbols of status? Or do they reflect a warrior role? The truth may be a combination of all three, varying case by case. What matters is that the iconography of the warrior woman was real enough to be honored in death, and that alone tells us something about the possibilities open to women in Norse society. It's also important to understand that combat in the Viking Age wasn't always a professional affair. During raids, defense of homesteads, or internal clan feuds, women likely took up arms when needed. Their strength, agility, and resilience were essential for survival in harsh Nordic environments, and they weren't always afforded the luxury of staying behind the front lines. Beyond physical combat, Norse cosmology wove warrior women into the very fabric of fate. The Valkyrjur, or Valkyries, were semi-divine female beings who chose who would die in battle and who would live. They rode across the skies with spears and armor, guiding the souls of fallen warriors to Valhalla. These mythic figures weren't gentle angels, they were fearsome, often bloodthirsty agents of death. And they were revered, not feared. Their presence in myth may reflect real societal respect for women who took on roles of battle and destiny. The image of the Shield Maiden also had psychological power. In a world where warfare was brutal and honor meant everything, the idea that women could fight and die with the same valor as men reinforced values of courage, resilience, and loyalty. These traits were not gendered, they were cultural ideals. The sagas do not shy away from showing women who outwit, outperform, and even outfight men. Whether real or legendary, these women were not ridiculed or diminished. They were celebrated. Not all warriors wore armor. Some women wielded power through their words, prophecies, or political maneuvering. But for those who did take up the sword, the sagas grant them a place of honor. They aren't mocked or portrayed as unnatural. Instead, they are part of the heroic tradition. There's also a social layer worth exploring. Viking culture valued personal strength and loyalty to one's kin above strict gender roles. While not every woman became a warrior, those who did were not automatically marginalized. The very existence of the shield maiden archetype suggests a society flexible enough to allow such figures not only to exist, but to be immortalized in its greatest stories. Modern interpretations, whether in films, television, or video games, often exaggerate or simplify these roles, but at their core, they're reaching for something real: the Viking Age's complex view of gender, strength, and honor. Shield maidens remind us that in Norse society, courage and capability mattered more than conformity. Viking women could lead, fight, and command, and sometimes they died on the battlefield sword in hand, head held high. To understand the Viking afterlife, we must first understand how the Norse viewed death, fate, and the soul. For them, death was not an end, but a transformation, a journey from one realm to another. Life and death were deeply woven into the fabric of fate, controlled by forces that even the gods could not escape. At the heart of Norse cosmology stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, whose branches and roots held the 9 realms. The realms of the living and the dead existed side by side, often separated by little more than a veil of fate. The Norns' mysterious female beings wove the destinies of gods and men alike, carving runes into the tree's roots. Their work determined who would live, who would die, and how each soul would meet its end. To a Viking, the way one died mattered. A warrior slain in battle was honored and often believed to be taken to Valhalla or Folkvanger. But those who died of old age, illness, or other unheroic causes might find themselves in Hel, a realm ruled not by fire and torment, but by cold silence and shadow. The soul itself was a complex concept. Norse belief did not revolve around a single, indivisible soul like in many later religious systems. Instead, a person had multiple spiritual elements. There was the hugr, which was the mind, thoughts, and will; the hamr, a kind of shape or form that could change, especially in dreams or in death; and the fylgja, a spirit companion, often taking the shape of an animal, linked to one's fate. The Disir and Valkyries, female spirits associated with family and battle, also played roles in guiding souls after death. Burial customs offer clues to these beliefs. High-status warriors and chieftains were often buried with weapons, food, ships, and sometimes even slaves or animals. These items weren't mere symbols of status, they were thought to be needed in the afterlife. Grave goods served as tools, protection, and provisions for the journey beyond. The ship burial, in particular, reflects the idea that the soul must travel across some cosmic sea to reach the next world. Interestingly, cremation was also common, especially in earlier periods. The burning of the body released the spirit and helped it pass into the next realm. The smoke, rising toward the sky, was sometimes believed to carry the soul toward the gods. But this wasn't always seen as a path to Valhalla. The specific destination depended on more than just the funeral ritual. Valhalla, often portrayed in modern culture as the one and only Viking heaven, was actually one of several possible destinations for the dead. It was ruled by Odin, the Allfather, and reserved for the brave, those chosen by Valkyries on the battlefield. But even Valhalla had a specific purpose: to prepare warriors for Ragnarok, the end of the world. The Einherjar, fallen heroes who trained and feasted in Valhalla, were not resting in peace. They were waiting to fight again, to battle in the final war alongside Odin. For others, there was Folkvanger, a realm ruled by the goddess Freya. It is said that Freya took the first pick of those slain in battle, while Odin took the rest. Folkvanger was a field or meadow, perhaps more peaceful than Valhalla, but equally noble in purpose. This duality in the warrior afterlife shows the richness of Norse belief. It wasn't just about honor and glory, but also balance and harmony between the gods. Then there was Hel, the realm of the dead not taken in battle. It was not a place of punishment in the Christian sense, nor was it necessarily shameful. It simply existed as the natural destination for those whose lives ended in quiet ways. Ruled by Hel, the daughter of Loki, this realm was cold, dark, and distant. But it was also orderly and essential, a place for the majority, not a prison for the damned. The idea that only warriors had a glorious afterlife is a modern oversimplification. Farmers, mothers, seers, craftsmen, all had their place in the grand scheme. Some believed in reincarnation within families, others in ancestral protection from beyond. The dead were not forgotten. They were honored, spoken to, and invited to feasts. Burial mounds became sacred sites, not just tombs, but bridges between the living and the dead. The Norse also believed in restless spirits, those who died violently or with unfinished business. These spirits, called draugr, could rise from their graves and haunt the living. They were not necessarily evil, but dangerous and powerful. Proper burial rites and remembrance were crucial to prevent such unrest. A well-buried soul had peace. A forgotten one might return with rage. What emerges is a deeply personal and communal view of death. The afterlife wasn't something abstract and far away. It was part of everyday life. It shaped how Vikings lived, how they fought, and how they remembered their ancestors. In their worldview, death was a door, not a wall. And what lay beyond that door depended not just on how you died, but on how you were remembered. Among all the realms of the Viking afterlife, none has captured modern imagination like Valhalla, often depicted as a golden hall in the sky, filled with feasting warriors and endless battle. Valhalla was more than just a reward. It was a duty, a calling, and a preparation for the end of the world. The word Valhalla comes from Old Norse Valhil, meaning Hall of the Slain. It was located in Asgard, the realm of the Aesir gods, and ruled by Odin, the god of war, wisdom, and death. But entry into Valhalla was not automatic, even for brave warriors. Only those chosen by Odin's shield maidens, the Valkyries, were allowed to enter. These supernatural beings roamed battlefields, selecting the most worthy fallen to carry to their master. The journey to Valhalla began in death. As warriors fell in combat, the Valkyries appeared, sometimes described as beautiful maidens, other times as fearsome spirits in armor, riding wolves and carrying spears. They would lift the soul from the fallen body and guide it to Asgard. The journey might involve crossing dangerous bridges, sailing across otherworldly seas, or passing through hidden gateways. These were not literal routes, but spiritual transitions reflecting the belief that the soul had to prove itself even after death. Once in Valhalla, the warrior joined the ranks of the Einherjar, the lone fighters. These were the chosen dead, honored above all others. Every day, they trained and fought each other in glorious combat, dying and rising again without pain or lasting wounds. Each evening, they feasted together in the vast hall of Valhalla, whose ceiling was made of shining shields and whose rafters were spears. The meat came from a magical boar named Sahrimnir, who was cooked and reborn each day. The mead flowed from the udders of a she-goat named Heidrun, who grazed on the leaves of Yggdrasil itself. Valhalla was not a place of eternal rest. It was a military camp, a spiritual boot camp, preparing for Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods. When the end came, the Einherjar would ride with Odin to face the giants, monsters, and the dead in the ultimate clash of fate and fire. Their time in Valhalla was one of glory and anticipation, not peace. But despite its grandeur, Valhalla was only one version of a warrior's afterlife. As noted earlier, the goddess Freya also received fallen warriors in her realm, Folkvanger. While less is known about this place, it seems to have been a peaceful field or meadow, perhaps a gentler counterpart to Valhalla's constant combat. Some scholars believe that Freya's hall, Sessrumnir, was a place of healing and rest, rather than battle. This division reflects the duality within Norse beliefs: war and peace, fire and earth, frenzy and fertility. Valhalla's ideal was also a social construct. It served as both a religious belief and a cultural motivator. To die in battle was not only spiritually powerful, it was socially respected. It reinforced a warrior ethic, especially among the elite. Skaldic poetry praised those who fell bravely, and sagas often portrayed heroes longing for a death that would grant them entry into Valhalla. Even old men, dying in bed, might grasp a sword in their final moments, hoping to trick fate and win a warrior's death. However, there are hints in the sagas and archaeological records that not all Vikings shared the same vision of Valhalla. Some burial mounds are peaceful, filled with domestic items and feminine symbols. Others suggest a belief in rebirth, ancestral presence, or spiritual journey rather than eternal battle. Valhalla, while dominant in myth and poetry, may have been an ideal promoted by a warrior class rather than a universal doctrine. Furthermore, the idea of being chosen complicates things. Valkyries did not just select the bravest, they followed Odin's will. And Odin, for all his wisdom, was unpredictable and often manipulative. He might take a warrior not for their heroism, but for their potential use in Ragnarok. In some tales, Odin even engineers the deaths of heroes he desires in Valhalla, arranging their fates through trickery or prophecy. This introduces a deeper, darker layer to the myth. Valhalla is not a paradise, it is a trap of fate. The warriors there are not saved, but summoned for a cause beyond their understanding. Their glory is real, but so is their doom. They live in splendor, but they are tools in a divine war that cannot be won. And yet, for the Vikings, this was not a contradiction. To live fully, to fight bravely, to die with honor, these were the pillars of life. The promise of Valhalla was not peace, but purpose. It gave meaning to struggle, to loss, to the chaos of the world. It offered a vision where death was not defeat, but transformation into something greater. Modern depictions of Valhalla often romanticize or sanitize this vision. They show endless drinking and partying, with little mention of the training, the violence, or the burden of destiny. But to the Norse, it was all connected. Feast and fight, glory and doom, life and death. Each was a step in the eternal cycle. Ultimately, Valhalla represents the Norse obsession with fate, courage, and the acceptance of one's role in a grand, cosmic story. It is not heaven, it is not reward. It is the next chapter for those whose lives burned brightest in the chaos of battle. While Valhalla shines with fire and glory in Viking lore, the majority of the dead were believed to go somewhere else, somewhere colder, quieter, and far less romanticized. That place was Hell. But to understand Hell is to untangle centuries of confusion, fear, and Christian reinterpretation. Because in the Norse worldview, Hell was not hell. In Norse mythology, Hell is both a place and a being. As a realm, Hell is the land of the dead, who did not fall in battle. It lies beneath one of the roots of Yggdrasil and is often described as cold, dark, and distant. As a figure, Hel is the daughter of Loki and the giantess Angroda, sister to the Midgard serpent Jormungandr and the wolf Fenrir. Odin cast her into the underworld and gave her dominion over the dead. She is described as half alive and half dead, one side of her body beautiful and the other decayed or skeletal. This duality reflects her role, guardian of death, but not necessarily an enemy of life. Hel is not a devil, nor is she malevolent. She simply governs what must be governed. Her realm receives those who die of sickness, old age, accidents, or any death not marked by the sword. Hel's halls are said to be vast and cold, with names like Eljuthnir, meaning sprayed with snowstorms, and furnishings with ominous names like hunger for her plate and famine for her knife. But these are poetic descriptions, not literal punishments. There's little in the original sources to suggest that hell tortures the souls in her care. Instead, she watches over them, in a place beyond the living, a necessary counterbalance to the chaos of life and war. The confusion between hell and the Christian hell arose later, as Christianity spread through Scandinavia. Missionaries and scribes often equated hell with their own concept of eternal punishment, and later retellings began to reflect this. But in the original Norse view, hell was more of a final destination than a punishment. It wasn't shameful to go there, it was normal. In fact, many believed that family members could still communicate with those in hell. Burial mounds were visited regularly. Offerings were left. Names were passed on to children, sometimes in hopes of reincarnation within the family line. The dead were never fully gone. Their wisdom, strength, and presence remained a part of the living world. Ancestor worship and reverence were deeply ingrained in Norse culture, and Hell's realm was a key part of that. Hell was not the only alternative to Valhalla or Folkvanger. Some tales speak of the Alfar, or elves, and their mysterious dwellings underground. In some cases, the dead were believed to become elves, spirits tied to burial mounds, watching over their descendants. Others speak of sea burials, where souls might join the ancestors in the deep. The Norse world offered multiple destinations after death, depending on who you were, how you lived, and how you died. There was also the belief in reincarnation, particularly within one's own family. A child might be named after a deceased relative and inherit not just their name, but part of their spirit. This wasn't seen as strange, it was a natural continuation of the family's power and presence. Dreams, visions, and omens were often interpreted as messages from the dead, guiding the living across generations. Some souls, however, found no peace. The Draugr undead spirits were feared as revenants who returned to the world of the living. These beings often dwelled in their own graves, guarding treasure or seeking revenge. They were physical, strong, and dangerous. To prevent a person from becoming a Draugr, specific rituals were followed: cutting nails, binding the body, placing special objects in the grave. Fear of the unquiet dead was very real, and so was the desire to bury correctly and respectfully. Hel also plays a role in the great prophecy of Ragnarok. At the end of time, she will release an army of the dead, led by her own forces, to battle the gods. This is not out of evil, but destiny. In Norse myth, even the gods are bound by fate. Hel, like her siblings, fulfills her role in the cosmic balance. Life must end, the world must die, to be reborn. The diversity of afterlife beliefs in Norse culture reflects a worldview that was far from simplistic. There was no single heaven or hell. Instead, there were paths intertwined, mysterious, shaped by personal action and cosmic order. There was a place for warriors, a place for the peaceful dead, a place for ancestors, and even a place for those who returned. These beliefs also changed over time and by region. Icelandic sagas, Norwegian poetry, and Swedish grave goods don't always tell the same story. Local customs shaped how death was understood and honored. And as Christianity began to merge with local beliefs, new hybrids appeared: crosses and Thor's hammers buried side by side, prayers to both Christ and the old gods. Hell reimagined through a Christian lens. But at the core, the Norse view of the afterlife was about relationship between the living and the dead, the gods and mortals, the past and the future. Death was not feared as an end, but faced as a part of the journey. The dead remained part of the community, honored in feasts, stories, and stone. To the Vikings, the world was not divided neatly into good and evil, reward and punishment. It was complex, cyclical, and rooted in destiny. Hell was not a place to be feared, but a realm to be understood. And in that understanding lies the true legacy of the Viking afterlife, a world where every soul had its place, and where memory was stronger than death itself.